What if I told you Microsoft just dropped a new VM series that could lower your Azure Virtual Desktop costs, increase user density, and improve end user performance at the same time? Because that's exactly what we need to talk about today. Just recently quietly announced a public preview of the V7 VM series, powered by Intel Xeon 6, and for AVD and VDI workloads. This could be a pretty big deal. But here's the catch. I don't think everyone should be rushing to migrate onto these new VM SKUs when they're released. In some scenarios, moving to V7 could be absolutely the right choice. In others, it might make very little difference. And in a few use cases, it could actually be the wrong move altogether. So, in this video, I'm going to break down how the V7 compares to like V3, V4, V5, and V6, and what it means for real-world EC workloads. How could it affect the host pool sizing and the cost per user, and whether this changes the AVD versus Windows 365 conversation at all. And right near the end, I'll show you one scenario where sticking with the V5 or V6 may still be the smart decision. So let's get into the video. And if you're new here, welcome to the Virtual Mac Users channel. On this channel, I review the latest news around Azure Virtual Desktop, Windows 365, Intune, Nerdio, and much more. If that's the type of content that you like, please click the like and subscribe button where I publish new videos every single week. So before we get into results, let's quickly talk about what's changed with the V7. These new Azure VMs are powered by the Intel Xeon 6 Granite Rapids, and this looks like more than just a small generational update. Yes, Microsoft is talking about turbo speeds up to 4.2 GHz, but for EC workloads, the biggest story is the stronger general compute performance and much higher memory bandwidth. And that matters because Azure Virtual Desktop on Windows 365, what we really care about is responsiveness, right? How smooth does Teams feel? How quickly the applications open? How many users can you fit onto your session host before the experience starts to suffer? So if the V7 really does improve CPU responsiveness and memory free, that could mean a much better user experience, better performance, and potentially better cost efficiency. But of course, the key question is whether this actually shows up in testing. So rather than just repeat the announcement, I just wanted to compare the V3, V4, V5, and V6 and the V7 side by side and see if the performance gains are actually meaningful for real world EUC workloads. So I don't actually have access to any software where I could do real world EUC testing. So what I decided to do for this test was I just used some third party software just to test the scores essentially. So I used a tool called PassMark. And that basically tests a number of scenarios. It runs a number of tests where it's kind of tests the disks, it tests the CPU, and also the memory, right? And then at the end of it, you get results and you get a score, and it'll tell you what that score is. And then basically, I've just taken all that information and then put that into a spreadsheet. And then from that spreadsheet, I've created a diagram, which we'll go through shortly, just showing you what those performance gains are. All right, so that's enough for the theory. Let's actually go and look and analyze these data and see what actually is happening here. Okay. These are the results. Let me walk you through them. There's some interesting caveats to this. Now, I did actually run these tests a few times just to make sure I wasn't getting bad data. For each run, I ran it 3 times and then just took the average data just to see what's happening. But I'll walk through what my assumptions are for some of the things which didn't quite look right. So, as you can see, I've got these are the VM SKUs. So we've got a D2S V3, D2S V4, D6, and D2S V7. Okay. All the virtual machines were deployed in UK South, apart from the last one, the V7, because that's in public preview. So that was deployed in ECUS2, right? And I'm saying that because that might be one of the reasons why we had some slightly skewed figures here. So I took stats from CPU, memory, and disk, okay? And the total score is basically the total score, which is the overall score, essentially. So what I found quite interesting, as you can see here, was the overall score jumps up out a bit, right? So this is the one in blue. V3 got an overall score of 972, but a V4 got an overall score as 853. And the reason being is because the disk. And you can see here, the disk actually dropped down on the V4 compared to the V3. And the same happened on the V7 as well, right? Now, why is that? I suspect it's something which somebody told me once, where basically, obviously within Azure, your managed disk is essentially sitting on a file server cluster, and those file server clusters sit inside, obviously, the Azure data centers, and it depends on which one you hit. If you hit one which is much more recent, has a lot better performance, then you're going to get a better score, right? So it's independent of the VM SKUs that you're on, essentially. So just because you're running like a V7 VM SKU doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a faster performance on the disk, okay? Because it's a shared disk platform with other VMs as well, right? So this is why I suspect that we're seeing lower disk scores. And the same for the V7 VM, because that's the only one that was put in East US 2. So there may be a lot more contention. It may be on a sort of slower disk system, which is why we're seeing kind of the lower score with them. Now, if we just concentrate on the CPU, okay, which is probably the primary objective of what you want to do for user responsiveness on the VM. Okay, how am I responding? So we can see here, like the CPUs in the orange. So V3 got a score of 17, V4 got a score of 2038. So that's a 14% improvement. And then if we go up to the V5, we get a 27% improvement. And then if we go up to the V6, we get an even bigger improvement, right? V5 to V6, we get a 30% performance increase on the CPU. And then again, if we go up to the V7, we get up to 20% performance. So that's matching what Microsoft was telling us, between 15 and 20% increase in performance of the CPU as well. Now, let's have a look at the memory. So again, a V3 onto a V4, we're getting 22% performance increase for the memory. And then again, a V5, we've got a 10% improvement. But interestingly as well, on the V6, it drops a bit as well. So we've got 36% decrease, but on the V7 we've got the highest score out of all of them, which is a 61% increase on the V6, right? Definitely that is matching up to what we saw Microsoft is stating, that there's big improvements like doubling memory bandwidth and big improvements around the CPUs. You can see you've got 20% increase in CPU, 61% increase in performance compared to the memory on the previous generation. But then what really let the V7 down was around the disk performance, right? You can see here it went down 23% compared over to the V6, but I suspect that's a regional thing. So I think once the V7 VMs are in, I've rerun this test in UK South just to see what that score was telling us. So slightly disappointing, otherwise the V7 VMs would have just blew everything else out the water, right? So definitely interesting results. I found it really interesting running these tests and just seeing what kind of performance increase that you're getting. And as I mentioned before, what we generally see is an increase in memory performance, an increase in the sort of CPU throughput. That generally relates to a better experience for the users, right? So things happen snappier. When you click an icon, it opens quicker. When you're having Teams, it should be more responsive. It's definitely big improvements that we've seen there around the V7 VM. Big thumbs up from me, from Microsoft, for doing this. So yeah, that's the results. Let me know in the comments if you found these interesting, because I know I certainly did. So I'm looking forward to getting some of these VMs deployed into production to see how they behave. I also decided to run the same test for Windows 365 as well, just to see how that would compare and where that kind of fitted with all this. Because obviously with Windows 3, you can't select what SKU you get. You just select the number of CPUs, the amount of memory, and that's pretty much it. So I was interested to see, okay, how does this fit into the equation? So basically, this is the results of the testing. So as you can see, Windows 365 overall got a higher score. And again, that's because of the disk. The disk really letting the V7 VM down, right? So from a CPU perspective, the V7 VM was actually 27% better performance, and the memory was 4% better performance as well compared to a Windows 365 VM. So the only other caveat as well is obviously the Windows 365 VM, which had AMD processor, right? But if the disk had again been better, it would have got a much higher score. It basically would have been a lot faster than the Windows 365 VM. Interesting scenario, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of people choose AVD over Windows 365, because they get a lot more flexibility and to be able to do stuff like this, like they can pick the SKUs. But obviously, there's a lot of other caveats in there as well. So again, I'm going to rerun this test once the Intel processors go to GA and see what that disk score is again. So yeah, I found this quite interesting as well. So again, if you're after the absolute best performance, then it's probably best to maybe look at the AVD single session desktops rather than the Windows 365. But again, in an end user scenario, would they really notice that difference if they're just running Office workloads on a single session VM? Probably not. So yeah, it's one other thing to think about essentially. Next thing we'll look at is the cost. Is there actually a cost difference in this? And we'll look at that now. Okay, so now let's look at the cost differences between the V3, the V4, the V5, and the V6. I can't see the cost of the V7 yet because it's still in public preview, but speaking from experience, it may be slightly more than the V6, but not much. So It's one of my pet hates when I walk into a customer's environment and see them running like lots of V3 VMs or even V4, but maybe even V5 VMs, because essentially, as you'll see in a second, there's the cost difference is very little. And so essentially, when you migrate from a older V3 VM to a much newer like V6 or V5 or V7 in the future, and you essentially get a much better performance for free. And in some cases, it's double the performance, right? So let's have a look at the quick date. Let's have a look at the data and see what that's telling us. So what I've done is I went into the Azure Cost Center and had a look at the pricing calculator, and then just basically priced out the differences between the kind of different SKUs. So as you can see here, the V3 is actually £33.81. That's based on 220 hours usage over a month. Okay, so that's how much it would cost you to run that VM from the average workday. And then interestingly, in the V4, basically drops down to £33 a month, so it's actually cheaper. And then again, if you look at the V5, that's actually £33 a month as well. You can imagine if you're running a V3 VM workload, it's actually costing you more, right? You're going to save money by running onto a V5, and you're going to get a much better performance from that. If you are running V3 workloads, please look at this data and look at the performance differences that I showed in the previous chart, and you'll see that difference is humongous, right? And then obviously the V6 VM, that's generally the more expensive of all of them. So that's based at £33.97p, which is very little, right? It's like 2.5% difference between the most expensive and the cheapest. So that's not really going to hit your pocket more. Obviously, you've got thousands of desktops that make a difference, but for most customers, they're not really going to know it's like an extra 97p over a month period per VM. So if you've got like 2,000 VMs, that's going to be an extra £2,000 a month, which if you're running like V6 versus V3, I'm sure your users would appreciate that because they'll get a much snappier VM from that as well. So yeah, as I mentioned, V7 VMs haven't really been released yet, and the pricing, I'd imagine maybe, I don't know, maybe £34. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, takeaway from this slide is obviously, please, if you're running V3 VMs, migrate over to V5 or V6 because you'll find you get a much cheaper option and obviously performance as well. All right, so now let's think about why you would not want to do this. So a couple of reasons spring to mind when I work with customers on this. The most obvious one is capacity. Right, Azure has a lot of capacity issues, and a lot of customers are very nervous about switching to a different SKU because they may not have enough capacity for that VM. So if you got like thousands of VMs that are working like V3 VMs and quite happily you don't have any issues, then I understand you may be a bit nervous about switching over. But in theory, over time, the V5 and the V6 VMs should be more available because generally what Microsoft do is they'll swap out hardware within the data center. So they'll slowly take away the V3 VMs and they'll introduce more like V5, V6 and V7 VMs into the data center as well. You're actually going to probably get more capacity running on the V5 or the V6 VMs as well. Okay. The other concern that people may have is actually swapping them out. And what a lot of people don't realize is you don't actually have to rebuild the VMs. You can just literally just change the VM SKU, and that'll basically just pound the VM off, change the VM SKU, fire it back on again. The only difference where that does not apply is if you're moving to a VM which doesn't have a disk to a VM which has a disk, for example, and vice versa. For example, when we made the jump from the V3 to the V4, there was a slight difference in the disk, which meant that you'd have to basically re-image that VM if you wanted to migrate or build a new VM and migrate the user over. But I think over time that should be your strategy, like build new, like the latest generation VMs as you can, and if you can do, migrate the existing VMs across, because I say, yeah, better performance and it's much cheaper cost as well. And the other caveat to think about is features, right? So hibernation mode, for example. So hibernation mode isn't supported on all VM SKUs. You need to double check that. Stuff like trusted launch as well, just to check that. But hibernation mode, if you're using hibernation mode heavily, then maybe look to see whether the VM SKU that you want to move to supports hibernation mode. So that's when a couple of options like reasons why I wouldn't want to migrate onto the newer VM SKUs, but I think capacity is going to be the major pain point that customers are going to hit, especially with the newer VM SKUs, because there'll certainly be less of those available inside the Azure Data Center as well. All right, so that's the end of today's video. Certainly a lot of stuff to think about, right? Because it's not just a, hey, let's all migrate onto V7 VMs, because it's not always easy as that. As I mentioned just a second ago around capacity and stuff. But I would definitely suggest you look at the VM SKUs that you're using in your environment, especially using a lot of the older v3 VMs, and then see if you can migrate those off. Now, a lot of people hopefully would have been through this process when they migrated from Windows 10 to Windows 11. So hopefully when you've picked your Windows 11 VMs, you've picked the very latest available VM generation SKUs as well. So hopefully that'll see us disappear v3 VMs outside of a lot of customers' environments. But my general advice is definitely look at these SKUs. Always use the latest SKUs that you can and make sure you've got enough quota. And then, because say you're getting money for nothing, right? Literally free money. Yeah, that's it from today's video. I hope you found it useful. Let me know in the comment section what you're using and if you are planning to migrate onto the V7 VMs. Interested to hear people's user feedback. Don't know the dates when it's going to go GA yet. It's currently public preview. I think that's ending towards the end of March. So maybe April, June, July, we'll see these VM SKUs out there. I know the AMD ones are actually GA now as well. So yeah, all right, that's it from me. I'll see you next week for another video. Goodbye.